started, we're just going to do it's an overarching history of Fort Ritchie. The image you see above is what we would refer to as our historic district. It's the parade fields. This picture is actually from the Maryland Guard era. You can see all these little teeny tiny squares. Those were actually the tent platforms, which we'll get into here in a bit. So before I get into Fort Ritchie itself, I like to give a little bit of background on what was going on before and how our lakes came to be there. Lake Royer, named after Samuel Royer, who was a prior owner of the property, and then our other lake, Lake Wassler, named after the overseer of the ice harvest. The Buena Vista Ice Company owned the property, or owned a chunk of property there. It's from what I found, a misconception, or it was myth, that the ice company owns the whole fort, and it did not. It owned a portion of the property. Particularly for harvesting ice and sending it down south. It was owned by a milk company, actually. Thaddeus Wassler was the overseer. That's how our lakes came to be there. And one other piece that's no longer there that was prominent in the decision of becoming military occupied was the railroad spur that they used to transport the ice that came off our main line down at our lower gate, if you ever visit historic Fort Ritchie. It actually ran back past where Lakeside Hall is today towards the back of the property. So just to give you a little background on that. So I mentioned just now that when I came on, everybody that came in seemed to think that the entire property was purchased by the Maryland National Guard in 1926 from the Buena Vista Ice Harvest, which was just local myth. This is actually a consolidated plot map of all of the plots that were purchased from individual families before they were consolidated into one large plot. Now, late 1925, 1926, the Maryland National Guard had been looking for a summer training facility. They wanted away from a few things according to a memo that we've seen and Becky Dietrich's research, and they said they wanted away from the heat, the sand, and the bugs. This was perfect place, at least back then, for it. But the other part that played into why they ended up deciding on our area for Camp Albert C. Ritchie, named after Maryland's longest serving governor from 1920 to 1935, and of course governor during the time, was because we had easy transportation for the military to bring in construction materials, as well as transporting troops in for training. Now this was strictly summer training, so it was anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks, depending on what they were doing. The total property plot ended up being 631.2 acres, purchased by Adjutant General at the time, Major General Milton Record. Milton Record was a World War I veteran, heavily involved in the construction of Fort Ritchie, very hands-on. Recently read an interview done by Becky Dietrich when Mr. Record was 99, and he seemed to remember things pretty well compared to the facts that we have and the items that we have in our archive. So of course, I like to talk about the construction of Fort Ritchie. We honestly get more questions about the architecture and how the place was developed, probably more than any questions aside from the Ritchie boys. So of course, being mostly farms and housing and things like that, the property had to be cleared. And of course, somebody had to be assigned to construct Camp Albert C. Ritchie. Adjutant General Milton Record had served with a young man, Robert F. Barrick, in World War I and knew that he was a self-taught engineer. Impressive side of Robert Barrick is he only had a 7th grade education, but if you visit us today, majority of the buildings that stand today, the large stone buildings, were constructed under his direction. So they only had 2 pieces of machinery to clear the property. Of course, up here, rocky, stony, fence posts, lots of trees they needed to clear. The far to your left, that's a rock crusher. That's one of 2 pieces of modern machinery that they had. They also had a portable sawmill. All of that being cleared would be utilized to construct the buildings. They wasted nothing. The labor came from 300 men, roughly 300 300, 400 men from Hagerstown. They would be brought up every day to work and then taken back to town. Now over here, closer to me, your right side, if you visited Fort Ritchie, you always pass, coming straight through the gate, are what we call our finger buildings. They got that name according to rumor because somebody at some point said they look like fingers on a map. There's a lot of them, so that's a lot of fingers, but that's what stuck. But these are them. So the first 19 buildings were our kitchens. They were originally kitchens. It's very confusing because it sits on Barrack Avenue. Everybody automatically assumes they're barracks, but they're not. That road's named after Robert F. Barrack. Somebody had a good sense of humor. So these buildings were built actually much smaller than they are today, probably about half the size, in 26. And then in 27, they decided they didn't want to sit outside to eat. So they extended them to the size they are today for company mess halls. And these would be constructed between 1926 and 1933. The process for the construction of these buildings is quite simple. It's slip form construction, slip form stone masonry. You lay your foundation, you put a movable form as your wall, stack your stone, put your concrete in, move your form away, and there's your walls. All you have to do is put on a roof. So it was actually very productive. They actually went fairly over budget the first year, as happens often with our construction projects. So I'd like to mention a few of our historic buildings and their development, of course, centered our most famous, the castle. Fort Ritchie is well known for this. If you've seen the Amazon TV show, Special Ops Lioness, the first season, they have drone footage of the castle. Part of that was actually filmed at Fort Ritchie. They try to pass it off as Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg's not as pretty. But the castle was built, completely finished in 28, though it was opened in 27 when they officially opened. They just had some minor changes or alterations to do in 28, but that's it. In 1928, scaffolding's still up, working on it. But it was originally built as a reception center. This is a very Maryland Guard structure. If you go to a lot of Maryland Guard facilities, their armories are castle-age structures. The local myth is that Robert Barrack decided the reception hall should be castle-age structure because he was part of the Army Corps of Engineers, and their insignia, if you look at it and go from the front of the castle, is almost identical. So it was his nod to the Army Corps of Engineers and their efforts in building Camp Ritchie. We had two regimental headquarters. The 5th regimental headquarters, which is below. That is now the top secret tap room as you enter Fort Ritchie. On the right, the 1st regimental headquarters, which is not occupied currently, further down Barrack Avenue. Of course, our gates were built in 1933. Both of those headquarters were built around 33, I believe. And then, of course, our famous clubhouse, which is Lakeside Hall today. It originally started off as just a clubhouse for all soldiers. World War II came around and it became the Officers Club. And it's one of the nicer buildings on the base. So, of course, the officers get it. Now, I do want to remind you that I mentioned the very first picture, this tent, the cement platforms. There were no barracks at Camp Albert C. Ritchie for summer training. There was a hospital that was built there in 1938, and they had medical barracks that could house roughly 1,200 people. So year-round, there was about 1,200 people on site. Once summer came in and the soldiers came up for training, the occupancy was around 3,000. So all the way up until 1941, Camp Albert C. Ritchie was strictly Maryland Guard summer training. There were shooting competitions, quite popular in Winchester ammunition magazines. You'll find the Maryland National Guard or the whoever won the shooting competition that year. But of course, our most notable part of history and what we're probably most famous for is the training of the Ritchie boys of World War II. 1941, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, backtrack a little bit. Prior to entering World War II, our military had already begun to assess our strengths and weaknesses, and one of our weaknesses was intelligence. So we had already sent soldiers to train with the British in intelligence collection, which once we entered the war led to a lot of those soldiers coming to Camp Ritchie to instruct in interrogations. Camp Ritchie had its name shortened from Camp Albert C. Ritchie to just Camp Ritchie Military Intelligence Training Center, or MITC for short. This far on your left is a map that was donated by a local. It hung in his grandfather's dining room for quite a while. Unfortunately, the information that was on it was cut off. There's usually a strip showing the military information, but we can look at it and figure out what year it's from by buildings that are and are not there. So our, if you know the Fort Ritchie Community Center, their gymnasium was built in 1943 as a morale booster for soldiers. It's not here. It would be directly across from the theater. So we estimate this around 42 when they were proposing ideas for the uses for different buildings. So the Maryland National Guard or the state ended up renting or leasing the property to this federal government for just $1 a year, and it would remain Camp Ritchie MITC all the way through 46. Now, I've very rarely seen symbol unless you've seen a graduating certificate of a Ritchie boy. This is the Camp Ritchie MITC emblem. The Latin phrase "fas est ab hoste docere" means roughly it is a duty or it is right to learn from one's enemy, and it signifies what they would be doing, as well as if you don't know map reading, or at least World War II map reading, the map in the middle is actually a German map, and it only differs because of the different symbols that they used. So that's something that the Ritchie boys have been able to tell you. Most people cannot. Training the Ritchie boys training at Camp Ritchie involved several officers, but I want to go through the statistics of our Ritchie boys first. It wasn't just Army. A lot of people assume it was. We also taught Marines. Actually, several of our Marine soldiers ended up being killed in the Pacific in the line of duty. Roughly 20,000 soldiers came through Camp Ritchie. We do consider all 20,000 Ritchie boys. You may wonder why, because not everybody graduates, of course. Well, originally it was those that graduated and served, and then research unsurfaced that a lot of our Ritchie boys were pulled early for assignment. The military doesn't sit around and wait for you to get a certificate to send you for assignment. You go with the needs of the military. So, for example, we know that we had Italian soldiers that were pulled early to go to North Africa for the invasion of Sicily. So at the museum, we don't believe it's fair just to say you're only a Ritchie boy if you have a certificate, because even some of those Ritchie boys with certificates didn't always go overseas. If you came through Camp Ritchie, you used your training just for service, you're a Ritchie boy in our eyes. Now, 20% were German and Austrian refugees. We lumped Germany and Austria together at this time because at the time the camp opened, Austria had already been annexed into Germany. 20% were also other foreign nationals, a lot of those also being refugees escaping Nazi persecution, and then 60% were American-born. A very unique atmosphere at Fort Ritchie, or Camp Ritchie, sorry. Over 70 different countries were represented, multiple religions, multiple languages being spoken. We also had our Women's Army Corps, 200 ladies at Camp Ritchie, some of those even staying around and being instructors through the war. Sorry. And then, of course, we have our Nisei soldiers, our Japanese soldiers who served in the Pacific, or they worked with PACMIRS, which was the Pacific Research Section. So at Camp Ritchie, they learned 3 different types of intelligence collection. The first one being interrogations, that was the main focus. They took the original 16 principles taught to us by the British in interrogations and narrowed them down to 5 key principles, which is 1, exhibit superior knowledge of the German army. 2, act as a friend to the prisoner, offering things like cigarettes, because smoking was a big thing at the time, and other special privileges. Number 3 was introduce common interests, find a point of commonality such as art, music, and connect with that soldier on that point. And encourage the prisoner to speak on those topics, get them going, get them comfortable. The 5th that was utilized occasionally was exploiting the POW's fears. And for example, if you've ever watched the 60 Minutes, Guy Stern talks about dressing up like a Russian. Most of the German POWs were not afraid of Americans, but they were terrified of the Russians. So sometimes they would use the psychology behind that and get them to talk. But the most important thing I find that they were taught at Camp Ritchie was to never put a hand on a POW. They were taught not to use violence. Violence wouldn't work. There was no point. You make your enemy your friend. Use psychology. And that's what made their training at Camp Ritchie so different. I have a lot of young people that come through the museum today. That's part of the reason if you visit us, we installed an interrogation tent, having Ritchie boys talk about what they collected, why they collected, because everybody automatically thinks Hollywood's version of interrogations, which is often violent. The second focus at Camp Ritchie was photo interpretation. Very interesting, very unique training. It was essentially taking photos, developing them, and reading them with a stereoscope. And how do you read a tiny photo like that, especially if it's a couple thousand feet in the air? You had to read it by judging the lengths and widths of what you were looking at, which is pretty difficult. Because, for example, I think this is our U.S. Equipment and traveling position. American artillery pieces are going to measure differently traveling than they are raised to fire. They're going to measure differently from German, Italian, things like that. So they had to be able to read these photographs, assess the information, and a lot of the time this information will be put into maps or reports disseminated through the Army, through the military. Funny thing is, of course, out in the field, you don't always have that little stereoscope he's using right here. You may have a magnifying glass. A lot of the time they had to learn to adjust their eyes to read it through just looking at it. Well, we were fortunate and had one of our Ritchie boys that was a photograph interpreter kept some of his photographs. His family found them. That's one of them right here. Can't remember which battle that is of, but you could barely make out some teeny tiny little airplanes in it. I want to say around in here. Fun part of this training at Ritchie, every Ritchie boy went through the basics of all 3 focuses, but only the best moved on to phase 2, which would be a higher level training. Once you got to phase 2 in photo interpretation, you would have actually taken off in one of our aircraft. There were 5 aircraft that Ritchie had. They weren't kept at Ritchie, they were kept in Waynesboro. And you would take photographs and basically do the same training, but essentially from the air. And of course, there's order of battle, which was a crucial part of their training. They studied, memorized detailed information about the German military hierarchy, unit structures, troop movements, tactics, weaponry, all of that. For example, this is, I believe, German infantry regiment layout and its breakdown. And then this is German infantry weapons. This diagram shows their trajectory of said weaponry. Now there were order of battle teams as well as photo interpretation teams, interrogation teams, but essentially the order of battle teams would assess captured documents, whether it be official reports, newspaper articles, enemy orders, things like that, for vital information. Even something as small as this commander is really horrible, he demoralizes his men, that's useful in interrogations if you know it, and you're interrogating somebody under that person's command. So Camp Ritchie, again, was a unique training. Today we have virtual reality, artificial intelligence, military utilizes, but of course in World War II we didn't have those things. So they had to create warlike experiences because you had to be able to collect intelligence information even in the most high stress battle situation. Anything you can think of comes to battle, they tried to prepare the Ritchie's boys for at Camp Ritchie. There was a special group that was ahead of or put together the training, was part of the demonstrations, and that was the composite school unit of the CSU. This is the 81mm mortar and 30 cal machine gun groups. But they were broken down and divided into 10 platoons, and there's specifically headquarters, artillery, 1st rifle, 2nd rifle, 30 caliber machine gun, 81mm mortar, anti-tank, engineer, and interrogation. But each platoon specialized in these areas, but they also all trained in bicycle, motorcycle, rifle, and machine gun units. And they were responsible for creating the immersive experiences. We even went as far as building our mock German village, which I find differing information on where that actually was, but I've read in some places that it was behind the fire hall, or where the current fire hall is at some point. But it was much like a movie set. It had houses in it, had a chapel, had official buildings, and even some of the full houses. This is where they would learn things like tactics, clearing buildings, capturing POWs. A lot of the buildings would even have booby traps that they had to learn how to deactivate. So it was a very immersive experience, training at Camp Ritchie. They even went as far as having a mock cemetery that you had to pass on the way to the German village. And if you've been around the military has a wicked sense of humor sometimes. And this was no different. They often put humorous clips on the headstones to make soldiers remember things. To give you a couple examples, one of my favorites is, under the sod lies Mortimer Todd. He put his trust in a rusty rod. Clean your gun. And some of them were not so funny. The other funny ones go along with fools may come, fools may go. This one went, he drew too slow. And the less funny ones were, Billy Miz, he didn't practice, here he lies. So these were all little clips that the guys would have to remember. Or would remember. Comedy tends to stick with you and you remember things better when it entertains you. The CSU didn't just do the mock battles and interrogations and things like that. They also put on plays, a lot of those being comedies. And they weren't just at Camp Ritchie, they would also go to other local facilities or local military installations to do these plays. And most of those consisted of basically keeping your mouth shut. Don't give out secrets. Especially what the Ritchie boys were doing, it was all top secret. How it was supposed to be. Now I will say the military did put out something in the paper locally. Rumor is at some point, some poor farmer saw part of the CSU out in German uniforms, and they thought we were being invaded. So local rumor is that's why the military actually had to put something out. You're not being, no emergencies. It's just interrogations training or intelligence training at Camp Ritchie. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I've changed the slides correctly. Now, a lot of famous faces and famous people came through Camp Ritchie and were part of the Ritchie boys. If you've read Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger was a Ritchie boy. If you've seen the movie TV show Showboat, Famous bass baritone William Warfield was one of our 34 African American Ritchie boys. He actually put in his memoir when he arrived, they didn't really know what to do with him because they weren't expecting an African American. He had learned French and German from his time in the opera. Very intelligent man. He ended up sticking around, working with the composite school units, playing the organ at the chapel for services and things like that. And of course, the famous banker, David Rockefeller, was a Ritchie boy. Ralph Bader, if you like video games, or your kids or grandkids like video games, he is the father of video games. You may remember the game Pong. Two little lines go up and down, you hit the ball. That was him. Him and a group of other guys. If you like the Disney's Duck Universe, or was it Fantasia, the movie Dumbo, Tony Strobel was an illustrator for Disney before, and he went back and continued after the war. Vernon Walters, a Ritchie boy, prominent Ritchie boy. He was the head of the CIA, the director, in the 70s. There was a lot more. Arthur Roosevelt, grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, was at Camp Ritchie. He spoke 20 different languages. The unique aspect of all Ritchie boys is that they had to be at least fluent in one other language. That's how they ended up at Ritchie. Same with our ladies. Now, at the end of the war, Camp Ritchie returned to the state of Maryland. And between 1946, and this is another one of those things that's kind of confusing, because if you look up when the military took back over Fort Ritchie, it's 1948, but I have yet to find that date on any hard evidence. I found the date of 1951. That's actually on the land deed, as well as newspaper articles showing that Camp Ritchie would officially become Fort Ritchie in 1951. But between 46 and 51, the National Guard would continue training. Actually, according to news articles, it proved difficult after World War II, of course, to get people to come train with the Maryland Guard in the summertime. Nonetheless, but they also had the hospital I mentioned earlier. This is a blueprint of it. It actually sits on the part of the property JGBLI owns. It's on the opposite side of the lake from the event hall, from Lakeside Hall. It sat there until, I want to say, early to mid-60s, and the military tore it down after that. Lovely little article on the change coming soon to Camp Ritchie, coming around Camp Ritchie, talking about the changes and what would be going on. Camp Ritchie becomes Fort Ritchie, just mentioned in 1951. So why would the military come back after letting it go? Well, after the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bombs, and we entered the Cold War, the United States began prepping for nuclear attack. And of course, that is when the military came back and purchased the property. This time they purchased the property for $2,350,000 from the state of Maryland for the alternate joint communication command while Raven Rock Mountain Complex was being built. Fort Ritchie would play a major role in the administrative and the logistical side of Raven Rock's functions through Fort Ritchie's entire life. We housed a lot of its services, technical support, communications, military police, and other vital logistics, including being somewhat of a landing field. This picture is from a new collection of slides we took in last year, year before. A young man by the name of Jack Wicklin was there in 57. He was in our photo lab. He took probably 200 photos there at Fort Ritchie, which is awesome because we don't have a lot of pictures of the fort in the 50s. But as you can see, this is an H-21, Piasecki H-21, the precursor to the Chinook. It's also known as the Flying Banana, just for your knowledge. But it was basically the parade field was basically a landing field as well. We also had our own air traffic control tower, and things were expanded, of course, through time. Now we were more than just a little bit of logistical support for Raven Rock. Other aspects of our history include in 1975, the 7th Signal was installed at Fort Ritchie with a designated centralized mission information mission area. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Apologize. The seventh signal was responsible for CONUS's, or the Continental United States Signal Operations, which also included Alaska, Panama, and Puerto Rico. They managed telecommunications, automation systems, visual information services, printing and publications, as well as records management, essentially controlling communications for the Western Hemisphere. So, kind of important. As the Army drew down, though, in the early 90s, the seventh signal was inactivated, and technical expertise transferred to the Defense Information Systems Agency, or DISA, Western Hemisphere. The new command would manage the defense mega centers, which are centers where secure data is processed, to sum it up. If you've been to Fort Ritchie recently, if you know where the Discovery Station is, this lovely little building right here, one of two very unique structures at Fort Ritchie, more modern, built in the 80s, but it's what you call a SCIF. It's a sensitive compartmented information facility, or at least it was, not any longer. But that simply means it was constructed to prevent data leakage. This can be a room, this can be an entire building. And that's what this building was. It was kind of funny when our construction crew was going through, they were telling me about having to cut doors off that had like bank locks and everything on them, and they started cutting through, and there's like a 1/4-inch sheet of lead through the door. So they tore up a couple chainsaws. But a very unique building. Now it has a Discovery Station in it. And Meritus, where the Meritus Healthcare is on site, was a SCIF. So it is a sad but not sad part of our history. Under the Clinton administration, an initiative to save the government money, especially the military, took place. So it was the Base Realignment and Closure Act. And unfortunately, we went on it. We went on the list in 1995. Funny note, our fire department that now houses Cascade Properties, that was finished a month before we went on the BRAC list. $1.4, $1.5 million. And the military left a few years later. Anyway, but they went on the list in 95, officially closed September 30th, 1998. Though this is a lengthy process. Most of the information I give you in my presentations, a lot of that comes from the BRAC documents. You don't realize how much has to go through closing a military base. It's not like closing a regular business. I've read the historical record, archaeological record, and the archival record, which are all like epic. Lots of history here. And a lot of work had to go into closing the fort. Every type of report imaginable probably had to be put together, environmental as well as economic. And that was one thing that was bad about Fort Ritchie closing, is it greatly impacted the area's economy. I want to say a PhD student did a dissertation in 2006. I want to say it was like 13%. The poverty rose by 2006 by 13%, which is pretty significant when you consider our area.
Still there.
But of course, closing the property also involved plans for redevelopment. What's going to happen to it once we close? So 1997, the Penmar Development Corporation was specifically established to oversee the development of Fort Ritchie for civilian use. Actually it took till 2006 to transfer ownership to Penmar Corporation, and right after taking it over, they sold it to the Corporate Offices Property Trust, COPT, for redevelopment. The project began in 2008. The Fort Ritchie Community Center was part of that redevelopment project. Of course, thankfully, also saving the gymnasium from World War II. It's one of only 2 World War II era buildings still standing, thanks to their redevelopment efforts. But by 2012, Penmar ended up regaining ownership, met with a couple of the prior COPT board members, and they said, of course, due to around that time, the fact Agent Orange was tested on site had come to light, and COPT said they could no longer manage the property. So they handed it back, or at least that's word of mouth. Handed the property back in 2012 to Penmar, which regained ownership. And up until 2016, in 2016, the property was transferred to Washington County along with all of its assets. And I believe Penmar closed shortly after that. Of course, most of you may have heard about, I mentioned JGBLI earlier. They own 63 acres on the opposite side of the lake, across from Lakeside Hall. But of course, we're making history today with Ritchie Revival's efforts to bring back the fort. I think one of the major bonuses to having them here is I can tell you a lot of our history was on the verge of being lost. And thanks to saving a lot of these buildings, as well as they did help the museum get started. We are run by our own board, by the way, Camp Ritchie Museum, Inc. But they are definitely the reason we are here. So far, Ritchie Revival has renovated 118 of 126 buildings, which is quite impressive. These old historic buildings are not as easy as some people think they are to renovate. That's all Catoctin greenstone and concrete that you're having to drill through to put any wires or plumbing or anything like that in. Very difficult.
I don't want.
So, and of course, the museum opened in 2023, June of 23. I started in September of 2023. And we partner now with Ritchie Revival for some of our events, because of course we use the property. But we also help oversee the preservation of the property. I help advise, for example, they were doing some painting in one of the finger buildings, and as they were scraping, they unsurfaced some hand-painted, it was an RK3, and one of the finger buildings, and it was written in German Gothic. And of course, automatically part of this training, it was probably stood for Third Reich, and looking into what that building was used for, it was used for German Army organization training as well as map reading. So thankfully, we were able to save that, because that was something that was buried under probably, of course, several decades of paint. But useful little parts of the history. I can tell you that every single one of these buildings, when I say the Maryland National Guard wasted nothing, they literally wasted nothing. We have found that the rafters were often made from storage crates. We actually have one in the museum that still says "in care of Robert F. Barrick" on it. Remodeling 603, which is our building closest to the smallest lake, Lake Wassler. They were removing what they thought was wall paneling, and it was actually lids to ammo crates from World War II. And it's literally just like 100 ammo crate lids, where they turned, thankfully, the writing inboard, so the writing saved was just the backside of those painted. So they literally, military wasted nothing when it came to building these structures. So that's just a little overarching history of Fort